Thanks, Gervais. And this is the 10th iteration of this event. And Pim and Cindy, who organised the first one, Pim is here today somewhere. There he is. Cindy would have been here, but she's crook today, so she's at home. And 2004, Gervais, I hadn't realised it was 20 years ago, actually, since doing that with IO Global, so we'll have an event around that. Just going to do a quick whiz round the industry, actually, from a number of points of view, and the speakers that come subsequently to me will touch on various aspects of this, but those of you who heard me talk in the past don't expect an absolutely straight story when we get to some of these, including the title up there. So yes, the official title of the talk is Closing the Gap, but I'd like to give an update to our board late last year about the current state of the industry, a talk not dissimilar to this, and I called it the bipolar depressed patient, which is what I regard the minerals industry globally at the moment. It's in really quite odd shape at the moment for some reasons which we'll go into during the talk. And during the talk, I just want to touch on the things that are up there: risk, demand, AI, OBK challenges. And at the end there, rather than beating ourselves up too much, actually look back at the industry from a glass half full approach and actually finish off with something really quite positive and something that we can do for young people and for STEM education in general to bring them into the industry. Now, just to set the tone of the day, this cartoon is actually was not produced in the last 6 months or 12 months. It's 10 years old. It actually popped up in my Facebook feed last week, and I thought, oh my God, that's just perfect. I'm going to open the conference with that. I have some more comments to make about AI as we go forward, and people do regard some AI as I suppose, a existential threat to humanity. Well, if you train it on our history, then it probably would be a complete existential threat to humanity, because it might not think we've done a particularly good job and replicate our behaviour. Anyway, just to open that up, but to move forward, I'm not going to go into the critical minerals, a name that annoys me. I'm sure it annoys all of you as well, because we're actually looking at commodities and elements, but nevertheless, the critical minerals story. And just to note, copper, in my mind, it was always about copper, and it always will be about copper. As you all know, rare earths aren't rare. We can find them and bring them into production pretty quickly. Lithium, you can see we've actually done that really rapidly and has now flooded the market with lithium, and the price has plunged by 80%. Cobalt, similarly, there's no lack of cobalt. We can get it if you just want to pay a bit more for it. We don't need to be using artisanal miners in the DRC to get it, because it's elsewhere as well. And quite a few of the other commodities I don't really see as being a challenge to amplify the supply of them. But copper is different. I'd almost put zinc in that bucket as being different. I was a zinc explorer in the olden days, and finding zinc is not easy. And zinc and copper are something which have been prosecuted intensely for a very, very long time, and are already a key part of our industrialisation. So to then go and heap a whole new supply curve on top of what we need for our existing industrialisation is really, really quite a challenge. Nickel, I thought, was somewhere in the middle, but I will come back to nickel because that's even surprised us in the last 2 weeks. And I know we're not here to talk about gold necessarily, but I don't want to forget our gold comrades in the industry. After all, gold makes up half the industry, employs half of us, contributes half the wealth that the industry contributes. It also has its own problems, which I don't want to go into in detail. That would be an entirely other talk. But that's a gold supply cliff there. It's a pretty interesting graph. I like it because it doesn't talk about reserves. It talks about proven and probable resources. This makes this graph much better than the ones you typically see in the media. And there's a problem, right? We're not keeping ahead of the curve, if you like, from our gold drilling and gold resource definition. Another story. It's also in the sin bin. I mean, the price of gold is absolutely unbelievable at the moment, but having a great deal of trouble attracting capital on the various exchanges, including the TSX, especially the TSX at the moment. Risks. If some of you are into geopolitics and geopolitical risk, and these all affect our industry in the macro sense, Ian Bremer from the Eurasia Group is an absolutely brilliant speaker and a very, very smart man. And his group puts out this report every 12 months. And this has just came out. I think it just came out last week or the week before. And they were his top 10 risks. And I just put, they're all risks for our industry, of course, because they affect the macro environment. But I put red boxes around things which I think are really, really relevant and directly applicable risks to our industry in the next 12 months. So things like, Middle East on the brink, it seems to be getting I mean, the Pakistanis firing missiles at Iraq. I mean, come on. So Middle East on the brink. Axis of rogues, so rogue actors, which seem to be popping up. Whether you want to include the USA in that eventually or not this year is another thing. I'll leave you to talk about that. No China recovery. So that copper demand curve I showed you earlier actually looked different 12 months ago and had the deficit appearing about now. But because the Chinese economy is sort of itself in the toilet and the demand for copper for its industrialization purposes has dropped off, but not its demand for building renewable energy. But the increase in demand for renewable energy has not been enough to offset the demand, which has dropped just due to the normal industrialization use of copper in China. And China consumes 54% of the world's copper, by the way. So that means we've not seen a recovery in the price of copper yet, but I'm sure it will come. The fight for critical minerals is really a geopolitical statement. It's not an exploration type fight for it. It's just about securing the supply of it. And then over in the red herrings there, I've just highlighted BRICS versus G7 and why. This is a bit of information, didn't come from me in Bremer, this is from somewhere else. So in this map, I've taken the countries that abstained or refused to sanction Russia immediately after it invaded Ukraine and coloured it in. So all of those countries in red there refused to, well, they either abstained or they refused to vote against a resolution to condemn Russia for doing it. And you might think, well, that's a bit interesting. It gets a bit more interesting when you subdivide the world's resources between those two blocks. Should they become competitive trading blocks, or should the supply chains become balkanized? Is another way of putting it. So if we look at oil, yeah, well, that's a bit of a worry. Just as well, we're trying to wean ourselves off it. You look at gas, that's also a bit of a worry. Not so much our field though. But if you come down to the ferrous and other metals, then there are problems. And when I first saw this table tabulated and then that map I coloured in 2 years ago and what's gone on in the world since, I look at a table like that and being an old bastard, I can look at that and come up with a really good excuse to start a war. Actually, eventually, should things keep going the way they are at the moment, should the situation in the Middle East actually escape, for example. The other way to look at that, maybe in a slightly more glass half full thing, is from an exploration point of view and a business point of view, we're going to have to find everything twice or double the amount so that both blocks can sort themselves out. But anyway, that's just another way of looking at it. Other risks in the world, so climate, I know you're all aware of climate. That graph there on the right is pretty bloody alarming. There is this lady, Kate Marble, she works in climate. If you're looking to listen to someone that talks about climate change in a super calm, rational, measured way, this lady is your person. She is very, very interesting. And I've just underlined a few things she said in a podcast I was listening to, which are really important, actually. And things like, because if you're in climate science, you get accused you don't really know what's going on. Well, she says, well, we don't know everything, but we do not know nothing about this, which is an extremely important way to think about that. She talks about tipping points. And I like the definition. There's something that you cross that you can't get back within the timescales relevant to human lives or human civilizations. Suck your breath in thinking about that one. And then right down the bottom there, that we're not living in a story that's ever happened before. I'm sorry, that's just what it means to be alive, but we cannot normalise this. So the normalisation of deviancy is a type of bias. The longer this goes on, the more normal we think it is, the less inclined we are to do something about it, is a very, very bad outcome. And in a way, it's up to our industry to promulgate the proper prosecution of bloody fixing this problem as soon as possible. And just to, like I said, I'll get positive at the end there, but just to depress you a little bit at the moment, there are a few graphs that came out of the most recent version of The Economist. I just copied them out last week. Obviously, the global average air temperatures are a bit outrageous to look at that, but I think the one that really upsets me is the graph on the left there, where the actuals plotted outside the predicted range. I didn't read it in detail, but probably what happened last year was like a 6 sigma event, something like that. And you think about things, 6 sigma events and tipping points and getting things back within human lifetimes. You can spend a lot of time sitting there at night staring at TV, drinking bourbon, thinking about that. But it's not necessarily a great outcome, actually. We should be thinking about doing something about it. And I'm old, so, it's my kids and my kids' kids. They're the ones really that we need to be thinking about that. Yeah, another quote from Kate was that CO2 molecules don't come with tags. Once they go in the atmosphere, they're there. It doesn't matter who generated them. And I thought that was also a very interesting quote, because people go, even Australia would say, well, you're just a pissant little country. Your emissions compared with China aren't very high. And we say, but every molecule counts. Right? It's one of those types of arguments. Risks in the industry. Now, this is a really odd one, and it's almost a bit about the laws of unintended consequences. So nickel, I thought nickel's going to be a challenge actually to increase supply for making batteries. Turns out not so far anyway, due to the Indonesians. So back in 2015, Indonesia put a ban on exporting raw products, so ores. They said if you want to send nickel out of here, you've got to refine it and turn it into something that's value adding. Now, the Western nickel sulfide industry, including Australia, and I dare say here in Canada, sort of watched all of that and sort of semi-ignored it. I think so, yeah, whatever. So they did ban that, and then the Chinese saw this going on and said, you know what, we're going to go and invest with our technology in Indonesia and turn their pig nickel into something which is actually useful for battery construction, which has completely blindsided the Western nickel industry. All of a sudden, there's a surplus of nickel. The price is down 50%. We are starting to shutter nickel mines in Australia now, nickel sulfide mines. Just cannot compete on price, because that graph there shows the amount of nickel that the Indonesians have been added to the market in an incredibly quick time. And nickel from admittedly environmentally disastrous deposits to mine, but producing a product which you can use, which is actually battery grade nickel end product. Right? No one saw that coming, really, and the pace that would happen. That graph up there, 2023. That was a forecast from 2 years ago. I'm pretty sure they're already supplying over 50% of the world's nickel, so actually doing it faster than what we first thought they would. So that's a technology shock. It's a geopolitical shock. It's thrown the nickel industry into complete disarray. BHP, once again, with Nickel West in Australia, is thinking, what the hell are we doing in nickel again? Does someone, we were getting out of this, why didn't we get out of it? So now the whole conversation runs circular. And then the other thing that's hit the nickel industry is the swap out in battery chemistry. So this makes it really difficult for our industry to put in long-term plans to define and mine things when the demand can be up and down and change quite radically. The existing battery chemistries, nickel, cobalt, manganese, the suppliers don't like that because they're expensive and hard to get. So the technically less superior, or the non-insuperior battery, LPF, lithium iron phosphate, is actually getting traction and taking over the manufacture for batteries for cars, etc. So the demand also for nickel, cobalt and manganese for batteries in cars is going down. And again, that swap over in battery chemistry has happened far, far, far faster than anyone thought, and it will have a material impact on the price of those commodities. Other risks. So I did a straw poll late last year, and some people in the room here were part of this. And I asked them, where do you see what's going on in the industry in the next 12 to 36 months? There were 8 or 10 chief geos, basically, from different companies, different commodities, sent it out to them. They sent all their responses back, and to put it on theme here, I just concatenated them all, loaded it into ChatGPT, and said summarise it into 6 dot points, and that's exactly what it did. So this is, 4 months old, but it's still pretty relevant, right? And without putting it into ChatGPT, there was really quite a lot of consensus of what people were saying. Downward pressure on commodity prices due to global fiscal tightening. Geopolitical risk was high on people's agenda. So fiscal tightening, yes, but some of the other things like what's going on in nickel was a completely different cup of tea. US-China relations, that's worrying everyone. Resource nationalism plays on any people's minds. A decrease in the rate of shift to EVs, people were talking about back then, and that is certainly playing out, and I think that's playing out for a number of reasons. And I think people talk about the usual ones, charging the car, all that sort of thing. I think another one, if you buy an EV, it's a bit like buying a mobile phone in the early days. The thing's going to be obsolete in 18 months, and then what do you do with it? It won't be worth nothing on the market. So there are quite a few issues with EVs at the moment. Hard to get capital, sort of alluded to that with gold earlier on. People are thinking about technology impacts in our industry, so AI, which we'll talk about today. Quantum computing came up. I thought that was a fairly advanced thought process for people to be having in our industry. And then finally, we'll talk about this, and then Linda and I talk about this as well, but just the public perception and trust and our license to operate. So, they would exist most years, those sorts of things that people are thinking about, but they would go up and down in relative probabilities. Let's talk a little bit about AI. So when we get to those sessions, we have some context around that. The 3 Vs, I call it. generating data in geoscience. So the sheer volume, variety, and velocity, or the speed we're receiving data, just changes week to week. And we're very poorly set up to cope with that. It was a complete and utter understatement, actually. All of the existing ways that we deal with data, store data, visualize data, process data, by and large, are going to be, well, they're already out of date, and there'll be more, as each year goes past, they become more out of date. And just to think about that, if we went and scanned 10% of all of the drilling that's done in the work, including right through to production drilling, and we were generating a gigabyte per meter, we'd have 50,000 petabytes of data to deal with, right? And that just puts the oil and gas industry in the shade. How on earth are we going to do anything with that, right? So we run the risk with all of the core scanning systems generating a lot of data of having as someone was speaking about last week, the trough of despair or disappointment, whatever you would call it. We have all of this data rolling in. No one does anything with it. They blame the machine and throw it out, but that's the wrong conclusion. A little bit more about AI, large language models. Well, no one actually heard about a large language model until the beginning of last year when ChatGPT came out, unless you were heavily involved in this work. Some interesting stats about ChatGPT. ChatGPT has an IQ of about 150. Einstein was 160. When you give it information that's pertinent to that style of thinking, if you're thinking about words, and that happened pretty quickly. So the next generation, GPT-5, they're thinking about will be 4 to 10 times more intelligent, if you want to put it in those quotes, than GPT-3. And then the next version after that will be 10 or 100 times more intelligent than that. We are talking about something which we just don't know anything about, actually. And this is partly the threat of AI in the future, the threat and the opportunity. I'll put a note there at the bottom. If you look at the theory of complexity, people talk about emergence, and the emergence is the emergence of behaviours which you had no idea where they come from the system. If I get a few ants and throw them on the bench, they'll die. If I pour a few million ants on the bench, before you know it, they'll have a house, they'll have a track outside, they'll find food, they'll self-organise. No one knows how they do that, right? It's an emergent behaviour. Now, with the way that large language models are going, an emergence is a function of numerosity, order, diversity, feedback, and non-equilibrium. Perfect for a large language model. If you have enough of all of that, then we can expect emergent behaviours to start coming out of our large language model type AI. Now, is that good or bad? I don't know. Robbie will talk a little bit about how we're going to use this sort of technology to go through geological information, which is verbose and written, so well suited to this. Maybe some emergent behaviour in the future will find our next ore deposits. Right? OBK, value of information. So you may have heard me or other people talk about this over the years. This is I think it's a really important bit of work that we're doing, and of course we're doing this work with the MDRU and BRIM at UBC. We announced a big project, $1 million project, over a couple of years to really look at this in detail. But this is where it started, this work that Andrew Gillies did with John Steen, started 3 or 4 years ago for his PhD. The simple thing was go through announced impairments on the TSX in this case and ascribe a cause to them. When I was talking to John, I think he was back in Australia at the time before he moved here, I said, well, what caused them? What was, obviously commodity prices, geopolitical tensions, local communities, things like that. He said, yep, but a third were technical, what we'd call ore body knowledge related issues. So fully a third of announced write-downs by the cash or balance sheet are due to a lack of ore body knowledge. Now, that is quite damning, actually, when you think about that, because it's obviously avoidable. And people don't do it because they don't put a value on the information they're collecting, right? Who pays for what does not happen, right, is a way of putting this. Another way is you all pay life insurance just to cover you in case there's a terrible event, or let's call it health insurance rather than life insurance. But if you talk to mining operations, say, look, if we measure all of this, then we'll be confident that that won't happen. No, I'm not paying for that. We'll just take the risk that it happens. Well, really? But because you don't carry the can when something inevitably does happen. And lots of this stuff happens continuously. Every week there is something in the news around another mining clusterfuck. Now, you talk about securing capital to prosecute what we need to do, and if we're going to close the gap with the reputation we have, let alone with the general public, the reputation we have with the capital markets is dire. And it is dire for a very, very, very good reason, right? We are just very poor operators. We're very poor utilisers of capital, and we continually lie to the market. And what are we meant to do? We're meant to, give a promise and then overshoot it. We give them a promise and then invariably undershoot it, and by quite a way. They're a bit sick of it. I'm just skipping ahead. Another example here of some ore body knowledge. So sometimes to talk about the application of some of these thought processes or the lack of data and the impact it has, just to use something quite adjacent to the industry, but not in the industry. This is something in Australia called the Snowy Hydro 2 project. It's a pumped hydro project. It's a giant project. It's 2.2 gigawatts of energy storage. It can supply power at 350,000 megawatt hours. For days, it can power 3 million homes for a week, basically, when it's connected to the East Coast grid in Australia. Australia needs this. All of the wind and solar power will make sense when we build this, right? Because this will cover the shortfalls. Batteries don't cut it. Batteries come nowhere near this system. Absolutely. Don't even touch it. Don't put a hair on it, right? So these are the sorts of things we need. Short of building nuclear, but yeah, try that in Australia. So what happened? This is an ore body knowledge story, by the way. In 2017, said, let's do it. It's going to cost $2 billion. Late 2017, yeah, we're going to still do it. It's going to cost $4.5 billion. Then it went to $5 billion. And then there was a story late last year that all of a sudden it was $12 billion. Why? Because the tunnel boring machine, so Florence, Florence and the machine, the band, they call it Florence. They have two big tunnel boring machine. So it had hit the ground, moved 190 metres and not gone anywhere for 18 months. Why? Because they did not drill in front of where the machine was going to get the information to inform how they would run the tunnel boring machine and to identify risks. It's just like spudding in a drill hole, right? There was fractured ground, there was clay, there was water ingress. Oh my God, who would have thought, right? Just where you put the tunnel boring machine, that would happen. Well, they didn't. And they also could have had mud packs using the tunnel boring machine, just like we do. You can talk to us about that if you're drilling a drill hole, about stopping hole collapse. They didn't. And because of that, the cost has gone from about $4 billion to $12 billion, right? And put it behind by 5 or 6 years, which means we need to keep at least 2 ancient coal-fired power stations open for longer, which are meant to shut. And that will cost the taxpayers at least another $1 billion or $2 per year. Being government accounting, to cover this, they just keep increasing the benefit side. They just say, well, it'll be more and more benefits, so it doesn't matter how much we spend. Anyway, a bit crazy. Another just a real example here of ore body knowledge is a project we did with Datarock. This is a copper deposit up in the north of West Australia. We did the calculations. I don't go into all the details of calculations, but they're complex. But we as suppliers, you as geologists say, I want to use this technology, I want to do this thing. We need to convince you that it has value. You need to convince your boss that it has value. And we get a bit sick of saying, yeah, but what's the value? Oh, it's good, it's useful. No, but what's the value in dollars? What will it do for this project? So this project, they're spending $150 million just on drilling, going about the conventional way for an extra $5 million of spend. So front load that project with an extra $5 million. There's lots of detail here, but in the end, improves the classification of the resource into what's sulfide and what's oxide, which of course has a critical impact on the recovery of your coppers and sending the materials to the right place in the plant. Knowing that boundary and improving that information, not to perfection, but by 10%, just by that, increases the MPV by 25%, the IRR by 2%, reduces the decision to risk to build it or not by 5%. So $5 million bucks in the middle of a discounted way delivers $80 to $90 million of value, right? Now, if you take to your boss a discussion like that, it's very, very hard for them to say no, right? Because you've got to put a dollar value on it. So if I don't do it, I'm wasting $80 or $90 million. Not that I'm spending $5 million now, right? And reducing risk. And of course, with projects, if you can move an IRR by 2%, that's material in any mining company. So that big project we're running at UBC is very much about attaching dollar values to these things. And while we're talking about value of information and value destruction, perhaps I've got any Anglo people here, but it's in the public domain, and copper supply, that graph was made before, the First Quantum had their problems with copper supply into the market. And then shortly after that, Anglo announced they were taking 200,000 tonnes of copper off the market this calendar year for 2 problems, one at Los Bronces and one at Quellaveco. Quellaveco is a geotechnical thing, a fault. Los Bronces is an unexpected rock hardness problem in the mine. So I'm guessing now putting it through the mills, probably slowing down processing and drawing more power, so much so that they can't make money out of an ore block, which is otherwise above cut-off grade. 200,000 tonnes, $2 billion, that's $2 billion of revenue, fixed costs drop straight through the bottom line. That and a few other problems have had their share price drop by 50%. So what is the value of information in this case, all avoidable, all technically things which you'd be able to get around. So values. So what to do? I put a slide there, I just called it catastrophism. It's, and I don't want myself to come across like this either, right? To run around with your hair on fire, screaming and yelling at the sky and abusing people isn't going to solve the problem. But the media is part of the problem here as well, amplifying things continuously. The little quote there on the top left, I just copied last week. On Friday, oil prices soared above $80 a barrel for the first time in 2024. Oh my God, right? I mean, seriously. But people just aren't thinking critically. They keep reading these things. They really, really think there's a crisis going on when there bloody isn't. Right? So you go at the end of the bloody branch there and chop it off and kill yourself. And perhaps, in the future, that's one of our poor IO gas users when AI, really has taken over the world, sitting in some sort of dystopian planet, trying to work out where a new order posit is. And over on the right, that was just a screen capture off my phone one day near the end of last year. And, if someone had told me that they would be the lead items late last year in the Financial Review in Australia in my app, I would have said, go pull the other one, right? But these things are happening. So it is hard to avoid catastrophism, and we should. We should think about positive things for the industry. So, for example, things like mining disturbs 1% of the land area that broadacre cropping does on the planet, right? These are, I like these little factoids for conversations happening with people at barbecues, just when they think mining's an acid thing. Well, actually, no, farming is far more environmentally significant. Ignore the one on the left. The one on the right's pretty interesting. Apple's now worth about $3 trillion a year. I think Microsoft's up to nearly $3 billion as well now. But where is mining's place in the world economically? Just up there with Apple being at $2 billion, it could buy the world's 50 most valuable mining companies. The next 50 still don't have enough lever to snap up 3 years worth of global copper mine production and buy 2022's seaborne iron trade. So we are really important in the world, but we're not valued for it, right? All that other stuff goes away if we're not getting our job done. So that's a positive thing. We are important, and we need to keep reminding people of that. That's just a little fun graph there. Resource dependency just came up. Australia's around the bottom there to the left, and we're in great company there with Brunei, Australia, Russia, and PNG. Not a good look, but we export over $500 billion of resources to the world each year. Without that, we would be a third world economy. And indeed, they did a survey in Western Australia, and not the mining companies, but 70% of West Australian industry is either directly or indirectly supported by mining. The reason I put that there is if you go and talk to young people in Perth about mining, they're like young people everywhere. Do we need it? Is it meaningful? And most of them, their parents work for mining companies or work for companies that are associated with suppliers to mining companies. Anyway, just to finish off, glass half full. And John is going to talk about this. The industry's doing some interesting things. Reprocessing tailings. Who cannot like reprocessing tailings? It solves a whole lot of problems at once. It's great. More efficient drilling. So I put this up. We were talking about drilling later on. Ultimately, you can have all of the AI and imaging and geophysics and things we like. Eventually, you've got to put the truth probe into it to find out what's there. A really key way to move our industry forward is to make that process efficient, get it done on time, on budget, not have it delayed, go 2 years past, and use clever drilling technologies to prosecute it and have minimal surface disturbance. And a couple of other positive things here. There's the use of coal in the US. So things are happening, right? It's not as though nothing is happening. There is a target in the Paris Climate Accord to triple renewables by 2030. As it turns out, we've developed about 3 terawatts of renewable power generation last 30 years. We need to triple that in the next 6. We're almost going to do that, right? Business as usual has us getting to 9 terawatts of renewable generation by 2030 without doing anything on top of what we're doing right now. The reason we'll miss is wind power, not because of the technology, because of the permitting processes. So if we get that cleaned up, we will get to that target of renewable power generation by 2030, which then puts that onto net zero by 2050. So things are not all stuffed, if you like. And just a reminder here, this is something Linda and I will talk about as well, cool things to tell people about our industry. The only person that's been to the moon that wasn't a US fighter pilot was a geologist. Did you know that? So these are good things to tell young people just to enthuse them about the industry. And I'm going to finish off with a video.
the Earth is the only place in a galaxy where intelligent life exists.
Oh, you know this
As far
guy.
as we can tell, that this planet is the only island of meaning in an ocean of 400 billion suns. And therefore, if we destroy this, then we may eliminate meaning in a galaxy of 400 billion stars potentially forever.
This is our world, the only one we have. We love our Earth and we need to protect it.
Our planet will cross a new threshold where baby 8 billion will be born. On the day it is old enough to do so, it will ask, what did you do for our world and for our planet when you had the chance? If you knew there were education pathways and initiatives available globally, if you could help generations learn about these pathways and tools available globally today to provide long-term sustainability to our planet by giving your support.
All the children say, we don't need another hero. We don't need another hero. We don't need to know where all we want is like the young. So what do we do with our lives? We leave only a mark.
What will you do?
Is it all or nothing?
So things are happening. Think Live Aid. This is getting momentum. We have Mushroom Records involved, the BBC, we're getting government money. We will be, so I talk to these people, I've been hassling them for 6 months. They did not want mining involved in this, right? Think about that. They were dead against it. I've been talking to them for 6 months saying, if you don't put effing mining in this, all of that stuff's shit. It doesn't mean a thing, right? And that took 6 months of talking them around to having the ability of mining companies, mining technology companies to get involved. So expect to hear more about this in the next month, 2 months, 3 months. And then maybe we can all go to a giant rock concert. I think they're going to run them, one in Australia, maybe one in the UK, one in India, something like that. Already got commitments from, I'm not going to mention, but big acts, things that you would come along to see. So that's the glass half full. John?